well-being in labor, well-being and labor market. So my name is Maksym Obrizan. I'm assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics, right? So I'll be chairing the session. So for our presenters, I will be giving signs 5 minutes, 1 minute, and 0 minutes. Also, so we have 15 minutes for presentation, 5 minutes for discussion by discussant, and also 10 minutes for general discussion, questions, answers, and so on. So we start with Oleksandr Talavera, who will talk about self-employment and well-being in a comparative study.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank organizing for inviting me to this great event. So what I'm going to talk about today is about entrepreneurs and whether, let's say, financial development affects well-being of entrepreneurs. So that's joint work with me and my PhD students, Tofam and Maojan. So let me start from the kind of motivation. What do we know about entrepreneur? Like, first of all, well, this kind of image of entrepreneurs idealized. Well, we can think about success stories. The guy invented something like Zuckerman's story, how Facebook was created, and we can check, a number of publications in Western media, but on the other hand, like, think about entrepreneurs, like, do they have so-called work-life balance? There are huge failure rates for startups. There are difficulties during venture development. So then the question, let's say, why do people become entrepreneurs? If they become entrepreneurs, why do they still continue being entrepreneurs? And that's the question that we would like to answer, whether self-employed people are happier compared to work-employed. So if you take a look on previous research, what do we find? Well, self-employment brings a higher level of satisfaction among individuals in developed countries. What about emerging countries? Situation in emerging countries is different. I can tell you many stories when, let's say, there is no job in a small town, and then people are forced to be so-called entrepreneurs. Is it because they want to be famous? Okay. So research questions that we would like to answer in this research are the following. First of all, are self-employment happier in general than employed individuals? Second, whether financial development in that specific region where they live, let's say, affects choice, like the difference between self-employed and employed people. And how financial development affects entry into self-employment and affects exit from self-employment. When we talk about financial development, what is that? Higher financial development, maybe more available loans, maybe more chances for people to start their business. Okay? So far, so good? Okay, let's move forward. This research has comparative flavor. And we've got data from 3 countries: China, Russia, and Ukraine. Well, there are official and unofficial reasons why we chose this, let's say, particular countries. Let me tell you official story. So, like, these 3 countries went through the path of so-called transition, right? And experience, well, kind of planned economy and moving to market economy. However, there are differences in reforms. There are differences in financial development, difference in entrepreneurship. So it gives us unique setup for comparative study. Another reason, if we take a look on, let's say, relationship between financial development and self-employed happiness based on World Value Survey, like all countries in the world. And if you think, in this cloud, let's say Russia, China, and Ukraine are kind of average countries. They are not specific, let's say, outliers. So maybe what we find could be also helpful for other countries. Okay, so I've got only 15 minutes, and I can talk for 2 hours. So just to give you some idea, what are the main findings, and then we go more into detail. So first of all, a relationship between self-employed and satisfaction. Who are happier, self-employed or employed? We found results that Chinese self-employed and Russian self-employed are happier than employed. For Ukraine, we found negative result, so they are less happy. A role of financial development. Does financial development help, let's say, self-employed to be happier? Well, in China, result is insignificant, so no result at all. While for Russia, the more developed region, the less happier self-employed are. For Ukraine, there is positive sign. Let's say if person lives in more developed area, it means that there is higher gap between self-employed and employed people. We do analysis further to distinguish results between urban areas and rural areas. So the effect of financial development on job dissatisfaction, negative result, is higher in urban areas, and a positive result is higher in low-income and rural areas. And financial development affects satisfaction through both monetary, non-monetary channels. Okay, so that's kind of basic results. So let's go deep, how we found these results and what we did. So our data coming from China Household Income Project, ULMS, Ukrainian Longitude Household Survey, and Russian Longitude Household Survey. About Ukrainian data, there will be session, I think, later. Okay, and we consider only life satisfaction and job satisfaction. Actually, for job satisfaction, we don't have Chinese data. So like job satisfaction, only Russia and Ukraine. So in terms of our hypothesis, or let's say our specification, what do we want to find? So we link at our first stage satisfaction and to self-employed dummy, and later we interact self-employed with financial development. We use set of, let's say, regular control variables used in analysis. So satisfaction. How is satisfaction measured? So we all use on this kind of conference some types of survey where satisfaction is categorical evidence that varies from very dissatisfied and very satisfied. So there are, let's say, two extremes. How is financial development measured? Here is trick. One paper closest to us create, let's say, a lot of countries included, but using at country level, how financial development of country affects satisfaction of entrepreneurs in that country. We tried to go through different approach. Well, if you tell Ukrainian government you have to increase loan to GDP ratio, how can it be achieved? It's easy to tell, just increase loan, but it's very hard to implement. We tried to go through a different approach. We got our data and we have region indicators. So we know where people are located in each region. And we tried to constrain like regional development, financial development data. However, we did not take it, as it is. We tried to compare with average in sample. So like there are regions that have 30% worse developed than average, some like 20-30% higher than average. And so like our characteristics that we use for development, we are talking about loan to GDP or deposit to GDP. As robustness check, we also taken a look on, let's say, branches, like number of branches per capita measure. Results are essentially the same. Okay, in general, who are happier, Ukrainians, Chinese, or Russians? That's a question that we maybe are interested in, to start with. In terms of life satisfaction in our data, remember, it's between 1 and 5. So what we've got, let's say it looks like Chinese are slightly happier than Ukrainians, only than Russian. When we talk about job satisfaction, well, Ukrainians are happier again than Russians. So like there is kind of positive trend. In terms of, let's say, measures of financial development, and how our sample is represented. We can see that it covers most of Ukraine, and am I right that, let's say, Kyiv region, Dnipropetrovsk region, Odessa should be more developed than, let's say, my native Shepetivka, or let's say, Poltava, Zhytomyr, so on. So, like, nothing is wrong. Well, let's say Ukraine is geographically smaller country than Russia and China, but still we've got quite a lot of representation, region representation of Russia and China. Red numbers is kind of percentage of self-employed people. So we can see there are substantial difference. Think about 2% in Poltava compared to 10% in Dnipro region. Okay. To discuss about results, we need tables. So based on tables, like our first specification is, let's say, self-employed are less happy in Ukraine than employed, but results are insignificant. And that's we are talking about job satisfaction. For life satisfaction, it's not significant for Ukraine, but it is statistically significant for China and Russia. So like that's how we can see that self-employed in China and Russia are happier than wage employed. So maybe that's because in Ukraine it's kind of necessity. People don't have anywhere to go except starting business. All right, when we talk about interaction with financial development, like what do we observe here? For Ukraine, it's not significant in both cases. However, let's say if you take a look on Russia, and we are talking about job satisfaction measure, so in, let's say, more financially developed regions, the gap between self-employed and employed goes down. What's explanation for this? Well, like think about some market like Tryeshina market, you have 10, vendors. And then, like imagine, no financial constraints, 3 more vendors, came to market. Were existing, like vendors happier because of higher competition? Answer is maybe not, like they don't like competition. And that's how we try to explain. So another thing, life satisfaction. So for life satisfaction, we again try to see whether interaction, self-employed and financial development matters. So what do we see? Like if you talk about deposit GDP, it's not significant for Ukraine, for China, for Russia. However, when we talk about loan to GDP ratio, so like in fact, let's say, Ukrainians are happy, or Ukrainian entrepreneurs are happier. Okay. So that's actually, let's say, summary what I've shown already in let's say, text and what I've told you. So like next step, what we do, okay, general picture. It's clear. That's very important. Especially, let's say, this graph. So I'm talking to you higher, lower, but we need, like what happened if one person moves from one underdeveloped region to more developed region. And we would like to check whether, like this difference goes up and down. So I would like to talk only about this figure, and we have Russia, Ukraine, and China, and that's life satisfaction. So the more region becomes developed from less than 50% that less, or more than 50% more than average. So if you take a look on, let's say, China, it slowly like goes down. Let's say Russia, it goes up to the level. Ukraine, the one that started already low, can be higher, a little bit higher. Our next, I presented results for the whole sample, and next point, where we are going, is just towards, let's say, sample splits. We are talking about, let's say, urban area and rural area. We are talking about also high income and low income. Why do we have sample splits for high income and low income? Do we have information about income in our data? Answer is yes. But this survey type kind of data, and if each of you is asked about, let's say, current income, there will be, let's say, a lot of mismeasurement. And one way how to reduce mismeasurement is just maybe to split sample between, let's say, two categories, or have, indicators, a rich guy, let's say, poor guy, and use it in analysis. All right, I've got 1 minute. So for 1 minute, I will maybe go let's say some conclusions. So difference, rural, urban. Let's say we didn't find anything for China, for Ukraine. In Russia, we found that financial development reduces job satisfaction of urban entrepreneurs, but increases life satisfaction of rural entrepreneurs. Right, some figures, and let's say there are also some variations with respect to income effect. So like in general, financial development helps entrepreneurs in, let's say, rural area and entrepreneurs that, let's say, kind of have low income. All right, so if we have, I would like to conclude and to say, so main conclusion of this kind of long, maybe 80 pages story is that it's not always the case that entrepreneurs enjoy higher level of satisfaction. Like in Ukraine, we have kind of lower level of satisfaction. And that's the reason why we can have necessity entrepreneurs that can be less happy compared to paid workers. And financial development does affect entrepreneurs' well-being through both, let's say, monetary and non-monetary aspects. All right, that's all. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for the presentation. Your discussant is Elena Besedina, and you have 5 minutes. Okay, so here is the microphone.
Thank you. Where is the clicker? Can you put my slides? Nothing happens. I want to say that I was very interested and pleased to read this paper. Actually, it has some areas which are we also study in our paper, which I will present in the next session, about well-being. Yes, so the first slide is a traditional one for discussion. It's just a paper summary. So this paper studies the relationship between self-employment, subjective well-being, which is measured by life and job satisfaction, and financial development. For this purpose, authors use the longitudinal data from 3 countries. And the main findings of the paper are development of formal financial sector does not affect Chinese entrepreneurs' happiness. However, financial development seems to improve life satisfaction in Ukraine of self-employed and decrease job satisfaction of Russian entrepreneurs. So let me briefly say about the strengths. I think that this paper is particularly good. So definitely this comparative aspect is very important, because we rarely see papers which use microdata and actually have a comparison. So this is a very, very good point. And in the paper, there is a theoretical model which underlies the empirical estimation, which many papers miss, and this is the strength of this paper. There is a thorough empirical analysis, And a big part of paper is devoted to robustness checks. Actually, this is a strength, but to some extent, this is also a weakness because there is a lot of information. At some point, you a little bit get lost with all this job satisfaction levels, life satisfaction. But definitely, robustness checks never hurt. And very important, there is a policy relevance of the results because the paper makes the connection between financial development and self-employment. And if people are happy when they are self-employed and financial development affects entrance into the self-employment, definitely there is a scope for policy interventions. And, sorry. And the last slide of my discussion is the suggestions for this paper. So I have not noticed any discussion about some self-selection into the entrepreneurship. And here there is a related, since I told you we also study subjective well-being in our paper, there is a so-called set point level of happiness theory, which actually says that everyone has a set point. And so probably entrepreneurs are different from paid workers in some respects. So it would be good at least to discuss it. I think it will be also interesting, given the data you have already, you did so much analysis and preparation, it would be to look at the actual progression from one state to another and the change in subjective well-being. Because you study how financial development affects entry and exit. What is actually you can study is whether from moving from paid to self-employment actually changes the well-being, okay? And here definitely you will have to control for the level of happiness. Econometric point, I'm not sure if you, maybe you did it in the paper, have you clustered the standard errors at the regional level? This is, whenever you have right-hand side variables which are not individual, you have the interactions, but still. So probably that's a good one. And more or policy implications about, because you find, this is a very important finding, that in urban areas, financial development seems to have negative effect, right? While in rural, it seems to have positive. So probably, you know, financial development should target actually rural sectors. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, maybe want to address some of these comments, and then we have questions from the audience. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Lena. Very valuable comments. Let's start me. May I have them? All right. So like, what you got? Yeah, self-selection into entrepreneurship. Okay. Well, one of our questions, you know, okay, we don't only compare. Let's say, wage-employed, self-employed, but also entry into and exit from, and how financial development affects. Well, to do SW, okay, be well-being self-reported. Well, it's obviously possible just to add extra robustness check. but yeah, well, that's kind of good to know. Yes, we experimented with clustering, yes, as well. It just, let's say, estimates as the same coefficients will, well, standard errors will go up, but a lot of our coefficient already, let's say, is significant at 1% level, so it shouldn't be too much. Different policy implications, yeah, that's kind of obviously still, you know, work in progress, and it would be great, obviously, to extend a little bit implications part. That's what I think, you know, like self-selection into entrepreneurship. Whether higher level of entrepreneurs maybe in levels with higher financial development, and then to some extent. Like partially, it's not perfect, you know, way to address your comment, but partially we did try to, whether entrance into self-employment, you know, is affected by, and we use kind of simple IV. For financial development, we used, let's say, number of banks in 1991, number of branches, as instrument affecting, financial development now. Results are pretty much the same, but we are still thinking about fancy econometric way, how it to improve, this. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's time for questions now. We start.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, Oleksandr, thank you for the interesting paper. The question that I have is about the definition of the self-employed. Because you somehow seem to assume that self-employed are all entrepreneurs. And this is kind of the link and the assumption that bothers me a little bit. So I'm wondering what you know about those people. I'm asking this because from other studies, we know that self-employed people are actually usually a very heterogeneous group of people. You may have genuine entrepreneurs. You may have people who quitted their work and then they just try to survive somehow. You can have people who actually continue working for the same company, but they just change their status. That is, they become dependent self-employed rather than genuinely self-employed. And finally, in the context of China, you have a lot of self-employed who are family members, who are members of cooperatives, who are just helpers at home, and they're still in the statistics considered as self-employed. So obviously, the concerns about the financial development, etc., would be very, very different. So do you, from your data, know who these self-employed people are?
Thank you. Mariya, you ask a very important question, I think there will be session on ULMS, right? And in ULMS, they got question, current job status. And then you have employed, self-employed, unemployed. Right, and so our first, let's say, assumption, if you take, on self-employed, so these self-employed people are entrepreneurs. That's right, what we did for Germany, that's the way what we did for UK, and if we kind of assume, it's the right way to do for Ukraine, China, and let's say Russia. Right, obviously we don't know, I'll say too much about people. We don't have access, we don't know exact reasons. All we observe is just their status during interview, right? But that's problem not only with us, that's problem for any researchers that make use of this data, I guess.
Okay. Here we go.
Thank you for your presentation. Welcome home.
Thank you.
Yeah. Doing for more than 15 years research on self-employment, I noted that you are following actually conceptual enigma with self-employment and entrepreneurship. I do insist that there are different concepts. That's actually, I am asking you, as a researcher, how you differentiate self-employment and entrepreneurship, or they are just synonymous for you? Second, self-employment and entrepreneurship are different within different contexts: developed countries, developing countries, and emerging market economics. How did you explain it, or do you use this differentiation when you are doing your research? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Olga. I think this question is quite related to what been already asked. Let's say, ideally, we would like to get as deep as possible to find out, let's say, what are particular characteristics, whether those self-employed are really self-employed, or they just report that they are self-employed because they kind of help with some restaurant at home, let's say, restaurant. And let's say, what should I say? There will be OLMS section, later. Please ask them, why in their questions you don't ask about these characteristics, but you report only question, let's say, you include only question about current job status. And then, if researchers like me, get more questions to differentiate, obviously we are more than happy to, let's say, have different, like flavors of our research questions. However, we have to work with what's available, and we cannot, like move forward. It's already, let's say, some process. Nobody's done this before, and it's a great idea to go deeper to find out where the self-employed are really entrepreneurs or like just part of self-employed belong to entrepreneurs, and everybody else is just, like something different, and what this different could be.
Okay, thank you. We have time for just one short question, I guess, and then if there are more questions, of course, you can talk during the coffee break or whatever.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for your presentation and for this choice of topic. And I want to ask the first question about the choice of indicators for financial development. Have you tried to use some integrated indicators that use not only ratios of loan to GDP and deposit to GDP, but also percentage rates, the level of development of financial market ads? That's my first question. And the second question, we saw on one slide some summary statistics for such indicators as age, gender, education. How did you use them in your research? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tatiana. That's also very good questions. How to measure financial development? Most papers use exactly like this. As a robustness check, not reported. So, like what we got, like a propensity, principal component analysis, just like collapsing three measures and get indicator and use this kind of joint indicator. Let's say, in regression, results are pretty much the same. In terms of, let's say, individual characteristics, they're obviously all control variables in our regression. So, like, it's not only, let's say, 2 variables, 3 variables in regression, but there is vector X where you have age and so on. Let's say all results are in table, full tables. We don't report those parts, just main, things.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's thank Oleksandr and discussants and. Right, and next is Edward Norton, who will talk about unemployment and subjective well-being in Ukraine. So you have 15 minutes.
Hello, my name is Edward Norton. I'm from the University of Michigan, and I'm really delighted to be here in Kyiv, Ukraine, for my first visit to this country. This paper is joint with Elena and Irina Murtazashvili. So the topic of this paper is about how unemployment affects well-being or subjective well-being or happiness using data from Ukraine. Now, at first, this seems like a fairly obvious question. That is, we think that unemployment has a negative effect on happiness, right? It affects income, lowers income. It can really worsen job prospects or career for the future. It can negatively affect marriage prospects. And so for all these reasons, we expect, in general, a negative effect of unemployment on happiness. But what we're interested in doing is looking a little bit further and exploring this question more deeply, looking beyond just what is the magnitude and sign, but also looking to see whether the effects persist over time. Does it depend on the cumulative amount of unemployment, the timing, how far in the past it was, and does it matter how someone lost their job? Does it matter if the local unemployment rate is high or low? And are the effects the same for men and women? And we have data from Ukraine from the early 2000s until just a few years ago, the wonderful longitudinal data. And this is really good data for this project because we have complete work histories. And we also know the reason for the job loss. And because of Ukraine's transition from a communist economy to modern economy, there are a lot of structural changes in the economy, a lot of job losses that were exogenous. And in particular, one of the things we try to explore with these data are whether someone lost their job because of their own bad performance, or if they lost their job because the company was having problems and basically had to lay everybody off. So this is one of the things that's unique to our study. There's a long literature on unemployment and well-being. And so I list a lot of the papers here. And in general, they, in various ways, find that unemployment lowers well-being. But we want to explore this a little further and build on the literature in other ways. Going back to the Easterlin paradox, which was mentioned this morning, we're looking at income and happiness. When income goes up, at least cross-sectionally, we know that people are happier. However, it doesn't work in just such a simple way of the more money you get, the happier you are. And what seems to also be apparent is how your income or your job status is related to your peer group. And if your peers are doing a little better than you, it doesn't matter how much money you have if they have more. So related to that, we want to look at the effect of unemployment on well-being and a couple of specific hypotheses, which we call scarring, adaptation, and comparison, or social comparison, where scarring has to do with whether, just the simple thing of, have you ever been unemployed? And the idea would be if you're ever unemployed, that will lower all future well-being, sort of no matter how far in the past it was. Adaptation is a more subtle view of that. The idea is, well, it really depends on how long ago it happened. And if you were unemployed for a long time, we think that people will adapt, will gradually get used to being unemployed and figure out how to adapt to their new circumstances. And finally, social comparison builds on the Easterlin paradox and looks at the local unemployment rate. And the idea is if it may not be so bad if everybody else loses their job, because then your peer group is also in the same predicament. Although if everyone loses their job, it can make it harder to find new employment after that. So these three hypotheses lead to specific ways of testing things in a regression model, where the dependent variable is a measure of well-being or happiness. So with the scarring model, we want to control for whether someone has had any past unemployment in various years in the past. With adaptation, we also want to control for the length of the unemployment spell. And for the social comparison, we also want to control for the unemployment rate and interact that local unemployment rate with their own unemployment. So from these hypotheses, we get specific regression models that we'll use and test. So again, the basic idea of this research is to look at the long-run effect of unemployment on well-being, where we're not only interested in the magnitude and sign, but also the timing, the type of unemployment, the local unemployment rate. We'll look at differences by men and women, because basically all labor studies divide by gender. And we'll also look at the age profile to see how age is related to well-being. Okay. So the basic model here takes a measure of life satisfaction as the dependent variable and makes that a function of some measure of unemployment, a variety of personal characteristics, including age. C represents an individual fixed effect, so when we see people repeated time, there's some people out there who are just grumpy, right? They're just, no matter what happens, they're going to be grumpy. And so that would pick up that person's individual grumpiness. And maybe they're even more grumpy when they're unemployed. And then you have other people who are just generally happy, and so that the C is picking up that person's individual effects. And then U is, of course, the error term. So In general, we're expecting some measure of unemployment to have a negative effect on well-being. That is, the beta will be negative. And we'll look at the age profile of this. That's just the basic analysis. We want to build on that and create models that are specific to the different hypotheses. So for scarring, we're interested in just looking at, were you unemployed at some time in the past, yes or no? And we put in a bunch of dummy variables for years in the past, and we would expect that each of those coefficients would be negative. The idea, again, is that any unemployment in the past would reduce current well-being. We also modified this a little bit for two things. We looked at unemployment as the fraction of time spent unemployed, not just whether, not just putting in dummy variables, and we also distinguish between the two kinds of job loss, so due to your own bad performance or due to the company's bad performance. So that's going to add lots more terms when we do that. For adaptation, we changed the variables on the right-hand side to have to do with the length of time. So have you been unemployed consecutively for several periods or not? And we expect, of course, that for more recent spells of unemployment, that will be worse. But if you've been unemployed for a longer time, we think that maybe you've adapted and won't be so bad. Finally, for social comparison, we not only control for are you currently unemployed, but also the local unemployment rate and the interaction of unemployment and the unemployment rate. So for example, in this model, we expect if you're unemployed, that will lower your well-being. In general, when the unemployment rate is high, we expect people to be less happy. But if you are unemployed, it's not so bad, we think, if the local unemployment rate is high. So that third term, the beta 6.3, we would expect to be positive if this hypothesis is true. Like the previous study, we used the Ukrainian longitudinal monitoring survey, 4 waves of that. This is a wonderful data set. It has nationally representative survey of working age adults, detailed work history going back to 1986. And the measure of well-being, again, is this measure of life satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 5. When we run the regressions, we recode the variables so that a higher number is better. And we use, as I've mentioned, several different measures of unemployment, including a self-report of why they became unemployed, where about a quarter of the sample at some point lost their job because basically the company went out of business or fired lots of people. We have on the order of 20,000 observations. Let me just show you a histogram here showing life satisfaction. This is the original coding of the variable, so 1 is best, 5 is worst. So you can see that it's fairly uniformly distributed 1 through 4 and relatively few people in the worst state. And roughly similar for men on the left and women on the right. Here's the unemployment rate for men and women. The profiles look very similar, although the y-axis is a little different, so it's actually a little higher for men overall than women. But follows the same profile over time of going up rapidly through the early 2000s and then coming down a bit. So our basic results are the following. We do find a negative effect of unemployment on self-reported well-being in the basic model. Now, when we do not put in individual fixed effects, we find that well-being declines with longer unemployment when we use a cumulative measure. So the longer you're unemployed is worse. However, when we put in the individual fixed effects, which controls for a lot of these other factors, we find that the significance disappears. The coefficients on most of the other variables make sense. In particular, well-being is higher if you're married, if you're in good health, and if you have higher income. Those all make sense and are consistent with other results. So here are some of the results. We see that in the first and third column, without fixed effects, there's a negative effect of cumulative unemployment. If you're not in the labor force, that's negative. If you're married, that's good, and so forth. However, with fixed effects, a lot of the main effect disappears in statistical significance. The age profile is kind of interesting. I do want to show this. If you look at the dotted line, that's for people who have not had a labor market shock. So think of those as the fully employed people. And you see that happiness goes down with age. For the young people in the audience, sorry, that's just going to happen. Although it looks like after age 60, things start to pick up again, which is kind of interesting. But the other interesting thing about this is the effect of unemployment is like making someone instantly go to age 60 happiness, right? So no matter what age you are, if you become unemployed, you drop down to the solid line, which is roughly the happiness of a 60-year-old who is employed. That was kind of interesting. In terms of the three hypotheses we looked at, overall, we did not find a lot of support for any of them. A little, but not really a lot. There's no consistent effect in support of the scarring. At least in the basic model, when we did fraction of time, which has fewer variables and so has a little more power, we did get significance for women. For the adaptation effect, when we interacted current and past share of unemployment, we found some significance for women, but not for men, so that the women seem to be adapting better. And finally, for social comparison, we found no effect at all of the local unemployment rate. It is what it is. We looked, we thought these were interesting. We generally did not find a lot of significance. For example, here's the effect of social comparisons. You can see if you're unemployed, there's a big negative effect of about 0.3 points on that scale, but the interaction term is not significant. So to sum up here, we have this wonderful data from Ukraine, very interesting country to study with a lot of dynamics going on in the labor market, and we have great data for that. We find that in very simple models that current unemployment does lower self-reported well-being. In some models for women, the effect of past unemployment dissipates, but we really find little evidence overall for these three different mechanisms. Also, in conclusion, I would like very much to thank the translator in the back who is, I think, increasing the well-being of everybody in the room at various times depending on what language is being spoken. So thank you very much. I'll turn this over to Mariya.
Thank you so much. So your discussant is Mariya Aleksynska. You have 5 minutes, and then we have a general discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today, and let me say that it gives me really great pleasure to be part of this conference and also to discuss this very interesting paper. So I would ask the organizers just to please put on my slides also on the screen. And just as we start and as it's coming up, just again, I wanted to congratulate the authors of this paper. I think that the paper is very interesting, very relevant. Also, I congratulate you for doing this research in Ukraine, because there are not that many researchers who actually work on Ukraine, and this is really great. So let me just reiterate a few key messages from the paper, just to make sure we all stand on the same footing on this. So the paper looks at the effects of unemployment on life satisfaction of Ukrainians, and it uses different measures to assess the mechanisms through which the effect may propagate. So it looks at the length of unemployment spells, it looks at cumulative duration, absolute and relative, and it looks at the role of regional effects or comparison groups in this process. And the paper concludes quite strongly that the current unemployment matters most. So the current unemployment reduces your contemporaneous well-being, your life satisfaction. And at the same time, the paper doesn't really find strong support for scaring, adaptation, or social comparison hypothesis. Now, I have 3 comments for the paper, and actually each of them somehow is related to each of the hypotheses tested, and also they are presented in the matter of relevance. So first of all, I find that the paper somehow actually underexplores the role of being out of the labor force. The paper really looks at what does it mean for you to be unemployed today, to have been unemployed yesterday, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, etc., but it really only focuses on unemployed. Now, what I found really interesting, and this is an example, I just took a copy-paste of the table of results from the paper, is that indeed, if we look at the cumulative unemployment effect, the effect is not very strong on happiness, and also it is not very robust. And yet, at the same time, what I found actually quite striking, and the paper somehow doesn't really insist on it very much, is that being out of the labor force has a much stronger effect, and it is also an effect that is much more robust. Now, let's think for a second, who are the people that are out of the labor force? Again, as with self-employed, this can be a very heterogeneous group. On the one hand, these are people who are in bad health, who are disabled people, right? They are not looking for a job. These are students, these are military people, these are people with family responsibilities, very often mothers who choose to look after their children, right? So they're not looking for a job. At the same time, these can be people who have been unemployed for a long period of time and who actually gave up looking for a job to such an extent that they drop out of the labor force. Right? Because if we look at the exact definition of what is being unemployed, unemployed is a person who in the past 7 days before a survey has been looking for a job, has been available for a job, and able to take it up. Right? So out of the labor force, in the definition of the survey, is the person who is not. So again, you might have spent several years looking for a job, and then give up because there are no opportunities for you, because your skills are obsolete, whatever. And I think something is related to this scaring effect that can be explored much more in the paper, because how can you distinguish, how can you fish out those relevant people from your paper? You can try to see who are the people in the past who have been considering themselves as unemployed, and then today are considering themselves as not in the labor market. And then if you see any dependence between that, then you can really actually trace the scaring effect much better. The second point, and I'm going a bit faster on this, is adaptation to the unemployment. So basically the idea that is tested here is to what extent people get used to their unemployment status the longer they experience it. And I think the effects could be a little bit better identified if we could have some sort of controls for alternative sources of income, right? Let's say you have an apartment that you can rent out, so you have an alternative source of income, so unemployment maybe is not as bad for you as for someone who doesn't have this, right? Or for example, you are receiving unemployment benefits, you can qualify for them, so does it make any difference for you? So you can try perhaps to explore these effects. And finally, the social comparison hypothesis. Again, the authors do not find a very strong support for this because, in my view, because the measure that is used could be actually much more refined. So the authors look at the regional market versus other, they look at the regional unemployment, while in fact, when we think of who people compare themselves with, they're not really comparing themselves only with people who live in the same area. They're comparing themselves with people of similar age, of similar education, of similar occupation or sector. So I think, again, with the data, you could try to refine that, and instead of looking at only regional unemployment, you can look at regional unemployment within those types of groups, and perhaps you will find some more effects. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much. Edward, would you like to address those? And then we have some questions.
Thank you very much, Mariya, for those comments. That's really helpful. Sometimes when you work on a research project, you start looking at one thing and you look for that, and then you kind of miss some of the other things. So I particularly like your idea of looking more at out of labor force and what that means and the effect of that. And in particular, now as I really look at it, when you put our own slides up there, our table, is that the effect for men is much stronger. And that, of course, as you were encouraging us to do, gets me thinking about why. Are they the younger men or the older men? Why is not the same for women? Is that because women who are out of the labor force are those who are caring for young children or something? So there may be different issues going on there. So that gives a lot of great ideas. And also like the idea of if we can get the unemployment rate by, can we get it broken down?
Unemployment rate. We are not calculating it from within the sample because it's not representative by rayon. But we can try oblast level for that. We can try to calculate from within the sample. And
okay, so that would be one thing. But also there may be just different effects depending on your age and education. So that again gives us some ideas to explore. So why don't we move on and open this up for questions?
Let's have just 2 short questions, right? 1 question per person because we're a little bit behind the schedule. So who is first? Okay, so let's,
Let me rephrase Maria's question.
Yeah.
There are different types of unemployed, hidden unemployed, and let's say sometimes people do not want to tell that they are unemployed, you know, like, how do you control for this?
This is interesting. We have a presentation, a discussant, and then a discussant of the discussant. So I guess there I'll have to say we'll go back to the data, and in particular I will look to my excellent co-authors who have better understanding of the exact data set and the wording of the question. My Ukrainian is not very good. But you're right, those are very important to understand the exact wording of the question and what it means, and so yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank the speakers and the discussant. And now Mariya will talk about temporary and informal employment, work quality, and job satisfaction.
All right, so I'm back on stage, and now the tomatoes will be flying, right? So my turn. Yes, so thank you very much once again. I am going to speak in this presentation about temporary and informal employment, as well as work quality and job satisfaction. So in the presentation, I will follow the traditional outline and in this kind of presentation. So let me start with giving you a few words of motivation for why doing this research and why it may be relevant. So first of all, I'd like to show you some numbers on temporary employment in European countries with the changes between 2004 and 2014. And what we have seen in this past decade in Europe, but also this is very much everywhere throughout the world, is that there has been an increase in temporary employment as compared to permanent or what is known as open-ended employment. There are some countries such as Poland, which became a pioneer of temporary employment recently, with over 30% of all wage employees having a temporary employment status. There are also significant changes in other Eastern European and Central European countries, including Croatia, including Austria, etc., who have really witnessed the sparks of temporary employment. Spain has been a pioneer for the past 30 years now in temporary employment and fighting a lot of problems associated with it. And you see a drastic drop here in the figure, and this is following up the recent economic recession, where actually temporary employees were the first to lose their jobs because their contracts were simply not renewed with the economic uncertainty and the economic slack. And so basically this drop for Spain only shows you the extent of the problem. And the problems with temporary employment are numerous. Countries worry about the rise of temporary employment because temporary employees are the ones who have precarious jobs, are the ones who disproportionately carry usually the burden of the economic adjustment. They are the ones first to lose jobs. They are rarely eligible for unemployment benefits, so they really find themselves in precarious situations. So this rise in temporary employment is a big concern. At the same time, and I don't show you the numbers for various reasons, but there have been different developments in terms of informal employment. There are countries in Europe that succeeded in decreasing informality, including the Czech Republic, including some Baltic states. And then there are others, including in Western Europe, that have seen recently the sparks of informality. And again, informality is causing a lot of problems. And interestingly, informal and temporary employment are quite often seen as alternative strategies by enterprises. Now that we know this, what do we would like to see in this paper? And there are two following things. The first one is that now that we've seen that there are those problems with rise and fall of temporary employment and of informal employment, sometimes in the same countries, sometimes in different countries, we'd like to see how having the temporary jobs or having jobs with no contract at all impact the job satisfaction. So to what extent the job satisfaction of people in this contractual relationship is different from the ones on stable contracts. That's the first thing. Of course, the answer can be also quite obvious. We probably expect to have a lower job satisfaction of people with no contracts or with temporary contracts as compared to permanent contracts. And then the real question is actually, if that is the case, why this is the case? Because had the jobs associated to different contracts been exactly of the same quality, there wouldn't have been any reason to assume that people would be unhappy in one types of jobs rather than the others. So what I'm trying to show in this paper is that, in fact, the contractual arrangements do not have a direct effect, but rather an indirect effect. They work through working conditions. In other words, temporary jobs and jobs with no contracts are associated with also jobs that are of worse quality, that have worse working conditions. And it is these worse working conditions that render job satisfaction lower for people in temporary contracts or no contracts at all. So these are the hypotheses that I explore, and for this I use the European Working Conditions Survey, which is a survey run every 5 years by Eurofound, the European Union agency on working and living conditions. And unfortunately, this data set does not have information on Ukraine, which I regretted a lot. So I was hesitant to use actually this data set because I wanted to do something on Ukraine. But at the same time, let me use this opportunity to say that the reason also for using this data set is that Eurofound is currently collaborating with the International Labour Organization, which I'm part of, and we are currently replicating this survey a little bit everywhere around the world. So this survey now has been commissioned and underway in Turkey, in China, in the US, in Australia, and in Korea. And we're really interested to have it replicated in as many places as possible. So this is also for you to get familiar with this data and to see if there is interest to bring it to Ukraine, because there may be really scope for cooperation on these issues. So this data is very interesting and very rich. It does have information on job satisfaction, on contractual status of individuals, of workers. Of course, it has all the standard job characteristics and individual characteristics that a usual survey would have. And also, it has really a wealth of questions on working conditions. It has over 100 questions which can be grouped and which are grouped by Eurofound into 6 different indices, each of which represents almost exhaustively the working conditions that individuals may have in the workplace. So these relate to physical environment, that is how safe your job is, to work intensity, let's say how often you have to meet deadlines, how often the nature of your tasks that you're working on shifts. It includes working time quality, let's say what are the shifts that you have to work? Do you have to work on weekends? Do you have to work at night? It includes social environment, that is how much support do you have from your colleagues, from your boss, to what extent it is a pleasant environment that you are working in. Skills and discretion, how much autonomy do you have in your work? How much can you use your own decision making and your fantasy, let's say, in the work that you are doing? And finally, what are the prospects that your job is offering? Is your job stable? And if you have to lose a job, do you have career prospects elsewhere? So these are the 6 dimensions that I'm looking at. Now let's look at some of the descriptives. If we look at the levels of job satisfaction by country, here you have examples. In bars, you see the levels of job satisfaction of all employees, and then in triangles, employees with temporary contracts, and the green circles are employees with no contracts. So what you see is that with, these are averages by country, and in the middle, the blue line is, the dark blue line is the average for the sample. What you see is that with just very few exceptions, pretty much everywhere, the job satisfaction of individuals with temporary contracts is lower than as compared to those with permanent contracts. And employees with no contracts are quite often have an even lower level of job satisfaction. Now, if we look at the country averages and we look at job satisfaction and prospects, we see quite a strong positive correlation. That is, if you have a lot of prospects for your, with your work, then there is a correlation with a positive correlation with a positive and good job satisfaction that you have. And conversely, the more there are temporary arrangements in a country, the less prospects, on average, people feel that they have. So now let's see the empirical results and what I'm getting. So I'm getting a few sets of results. So first of all, I do basic estimations where my dependent variable is the job satisfaction, and there are all the individual and industry level, occupation level controls that you may have, and I include at the same time the dummies for being in a temporary job or being in a job where you don't have any contract, with a reference group employees with formal, permanent, or open-ended contract. And what you see is that both variables are statistically significant and negative. That is, being in these kinds of jobs reduces your level of job satisfaction. But what we also see is that people with no contract are actually quite substantially unhappier as compared to people with temporary formal contracts. I also do some interactions with Eastern European dummy, just to see if there is any difference between countries of Eastern Europe and Western Europe in this respect, and I don't see any difference. So, in fact, regardless of geography, this effect is found pretty much everywhere. And also what I do is that now instead I do the interaction terms with the average level of temporary employment in a country, and I do interactions with the average level of informality. And what I find is actually quite interesting. I find that, let's say, if you are in a country where there is a lot of temporary unemployment, and you yourself have a temporary employment contract, then you are much more unhappy than, let's say, a person with a temporary contract, but in a country where there is little temporary employment. So what does this mean? It means that, let's say, in a country where there is a lot of temporary employment, such as Poland or Spain, everybody is in the situation. So the transition rates to stable employment are so low that people who get those kind of contracts, they have little hopes that they will be able to move further. That's the way I interpret it. In contrast, in countries where there is little temporary employment, employers are probably using this form of employment only, let's say, to replace a temporarily absent worker, for probation reasons, or for seasonal work. In other words, they have a different strategy with respect to using temporary contracts. And in those kind of cases, the level of job satisfaction is not that different between temporary and permanent workers, because they know that they will be able to move to permanent jobs, but also perhaps because working conditions are not that different between these types of jobs. The situation is different with informality. In countries where there is a lot of informality, informal workers do not actually feel that worse as compared to regular workers. And the reason for this is that most probably companies in this kind of settings, they may be informal companies. They may be informal because they want to avoid general taxes, let's say, or registration. But workers in those companies would actually have quite a long-term relationship with their employer, even if they are informal. And so their working conditions may not necessarily be different. So those are different effects. So in fact, very often in the literature, we see that people say that temporary and informal employment is used interchangeably. This is not necessarily the case. And what I'm also trying to show with these results is that, once again, there is some role of the employers and employer strategies that is played here. So just the last slide with results is here. What I do is that I do these two-step estimations. So in each column, you have a different estimation, and the panel B is my first stage estimations, where my dependent variables are the working conditions, the 6 working conditions that I showed to you before, and I'm trying to see whether each of these working conditions is somehow affected by the contractual status. So indeed, you see from panel B the negative coefficients throughout. So indeed, people in temporary jobs or in informal jobs have worse working conditions throughout, except perhaps the work intensity, but otherwise they're all in worse jobs simply. And the panel A, that's the second stage estimation, this is where it shows, again, there is the dependence and very strong positive dependence. And here it basically shows that it is these worse working conditions that are then associated in a positive way with the level of job satisfaction. So basically my hypothesis worked. So just to sum up, temporary formal contract or no employment contract are both negatively associated with job satisfaction, but having no contract is a situation that is worse. The depressing effect depends on the spread of this arrangement, so it depends on which country you find yourself in, and the effect propagates indirectly through working conditions and work quality. So just perhaps a couple of words on policy implications. So now what can we take out of this, because this is usually a big question. And so what indeed can we do? So we've seen that people in the temporary or no employment are basically unhappy. So now what can we do? Well, we can have kind of different set of solutions. We can either try to think on how we, on the one hand, try to make jobs better, right, generally, or we can think about those transitions rates, how to make sure that people transit more easily from temporary to permanent jobs, and with this, let's say, how the overall macroeconomic situation and perceptions of being in temporary jobs improves for people. So from the first set of issues, we can try to think, okay, there can be legislative responses. We've seen that temporary jobs are bad, so we can perhaps try to limit the usage of temporary jobs. That requires putting some restrictions or some conditions on the use of temporary jobs. Some countries have chosen this path, some others haven't. The big also question is, how do you enforce those provisions? Instead of restricting the use, you can also try to render all jobs of better quality, right? Because again, we've seen that contracts go hand in hand with worse working conditions. So we can try to adopt more universally such measures such as equal pay for work of equal value, such as things, for example, that all workers are supposed to have training, let's say, on safety at the enterprise. It's not because you have a temporary contract that you would not get a training, or it's not because you have a temporary contract that you would not be given, let's say, a protection when you work with the equipment, etc. So all of those measures can be set up legislatively. They can also be set through collective responses, because we know that, well, the legislation, again, the big question is enforcement. So the collective responses in Europe, in countries where social dialogue is strong, those things can be set up at the enterprise level, at the regional level, at the national level, etc. And I guess I'll more or less stop here, and if you have more questions, I'll be happy to continue with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and your discussant is Hartmut Lehmann, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Let's hope they put up the right presentation, because I've actually 3. I've only... So. Okay, there it is, yeah. Okay, I think it's a very nice and very interesting paper, and I have lots of comments. So, but since I have only 5 minutes, I will limit myself, and maybe we can talk about it over a cup of coffee, as Richard Layard used to say. Okay, so the main points of the paper are that contractual arrangements, and we have 3 types: a permanent contract, temporary contract, or no contract, and job satisfactions are strongly correlated with the following ranking, that if you have a permanent job, your job satisfaction is higher than if you have a temporary one, and actually having no contract, you have a lot less job satisfaction also than having a temporary contract. Now, a geographic split east-west is not sensible, also because, of course, when I think about Italy or Greece or some other countries that would fall in the west category, there's lots of informal employment. Let me also say that I won't talk much about temporary employment because I've done quite a bit of research on informal employment, so I will be more focused on that. Anyway, so the split, it makes more sense according to the level of temporary and informal employment, which I put in quotation marks. This will become apparent later. The main channel impacting on job satisfaction is working conditions. And in the sense, I mean, employers assign a contract type which is then related in some way to working conditions. And this is also related to this idea of core of workers and the periphery, going back to Döringer and Pure. Now, to mitigate reverse causality issues, I mean, job satisfaction might determine working conditions. Contractual arrangements are used as an instrument or as instruments on working conditions. And they seem to be satisfactory instruments. There are some robustness checks that show that. Now, unlike much literature on informal employment, it is not selection-driven. So if you think about Maloney's famous paper where he basically supposes that workers freely choose where they locate over their working life, here I can see this. In this paper, it's essentially entirely or nearly exclusively employer-driven, which I think is a refreshing point. Okay, now let me be a little bit more critical. No contract might not be actually a very good definition of informal employment. So if I think about Ireland, for example, if you look at the picture, in Ireland, permanent employees and no contract employees have the same job satisfaction. And the reason is that in Ireland, for example, lots of people have no contract, but it's still clear that they have a permanent job. So I mean, this is sort of addressed in passing. So actually a discussion of definitional issues. You know, the ILO actually, ironically enough, doesn't define it necessarily with no contract, but actually more productivity, according to productivity levels. Also, I would say the labor market is a market. While it might not be satisfactory to look only at the supply of labor, like most of the neoclassical literature does, it's also not satisfactory to only look at or to exclusively stress labor demand. Okay, now I have a slide on Ukraine, actually, because I did a paper which I present here on informal employment in Ukraine, where this is, I think, quite apparent. Also, there are some variables that are quite weak proxies. Okay, so for example, risk aversion is, I mean, to say that in the production process, you know, I do certain things, and that means I'm risk averse. That doesn't tell me much about risk aversion in general, or even risk aversion in career matters. Okay, a final critical point, while the analysis regarding temporary employment is well embedded in the literature, the vast literature on informal employment and informality is actually ignored. And I think there are some implicit hints at the literature, but there really isn't a discussion or an embedding of what you're doing into that. Okay, so here I have two types of definitions, the productive ILO definition, and then the legalistic social protection definition. And it's good that you use, one more minute. It's good that you use just one. According to Canberra, you avoid fuzziness, because in lots of papers, it's not clear what they mean when they talk about informality. Okay, now, one of the things that we found in the Ukrainian cases, essentially only the wage employment column is relevant for you, that you have about 1/3 of people who are voluntarily informal, and only 2/3 are involuntarily informal. Now, the last point I want to make is that these are medium-term transition probabilities for Ukraine between 2003 and 2007, where we have 7 states, 5 employment states, and unemployment and out of the labor force. And as you can see, the majority of involuntary informal, which is this, and also of the voluntary informal, the majority of transitions are always into formal employment. This tells me, of course, that the supply is certainly important. And it's not that employers lock people in and they remain in certain employment relationships. Let me finish with that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you can just quickly go over it. Maybe we have time for just one question then, just because we have just 3 minutes before the next session starts.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Lehmann, for your very pertinent comments. And I must say that I'm extremely lucky that it is you who is commenting on them, because I was one of your students back 15 years ago here in Kyiv School of Economics. So
not just you, right, but many of us here?
Not just you, yes, but so it's good to see which lessons were learned and which weren't. So yes, the point well taken that no contract and informality are two different issues. And I was a little bit relaxed while presenting it here, but in the paper I think I'm trying to be actually very careful not to put the equation between no contract and informality, because informality indeed is a much broader concept. You can have temporary jobs that are informal. You can have a formal contract but then work in an informal enterprise which is not registered. So informality is a much broader indeed concept, and I will make sure that I spell out the difference, also definitional difference much better in the paper. Also, indeed, according to the ILO, there are at least 3 different definitions of informal employment, informal sector of the economy, and I think there is yet another one which I don't remember, but there are 3 different also degrees at how you can assess this. Labor supply and labor demand. Yes, indeed. Again, the point well taken. I think a lot of literature out there really makes this assumption that people take any jobs they want and they self-select fully into bad jobs with bad contracts or into good jobs with good contracts. I'm not trying to say that people don't make choices and it's only employers' fault to lock in people. I guess I'm trying to say in this paper that employers do have a say. And that, again, depending on the country, what we see with the results of the paper is that in some countries you clearly see that employer strategies with respect to contracts are quite different from others. So again, in itself, it's already a sign that employers must be playing at least some role in this process. Again, in contrast to a literature which only thinks that markets are perfectly free. And I guess that's it for now.
Okay,
thank you
great. Just one quick question, because I kind of, so any question? One quick question. Okay, great, then thank you. Oh, sorry.
I actually have a question whether you differentiated between agency employment or direct temporary employment with the company in this survey.
Yes, this is an excellent question. Thank you. No, here it's only looking at direct employees who have a direct employment relationship. So it's not temporary agency workers. Now I think there are some questions also in this survey which look at temporary agency workers specifically. They're still representing a very small percent of the population. I guess it can be interesting to look at what is happening to them. Sample size may be an issue. I know that the Eurofound report on this survey, describing the basic results of the survey, actually presents information on working condition of people employed by temporary work agencies, and they have some ideas there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for interesting discussions, presentations. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we don't have any